Hello?
You only think you'd want a time machine. If a modern-day person actually ended up in these time periods, it wouldn't take long before they'd be begging for a ride back home.
I'm not gonna lie, I do not like this audio.
If you believe what Hollywood tells you, then life during the Middle Ages might seem romantic and glamorous. Sadly, the truth is that life in the Middle Ages was about as grim as it gets, and death lurked around pretty much every corner. Grief is awful no matter what form it takes, but the passing of a child can be an unspeakably tragic turn of events. Luckily, we in the West are far less likely to experience this. In America, infant mortality is only around 0.006%, and that rate drops once kids leave infancy. Mortality for children between the ages of 1 and 4 is around 0.0002%, and for kids aged 5 to 14, it's around 0.0001%. Now compare that to childhood mortality in the Middle Ages. According to Representing Childhood, exact figures are impossible to come by, but estimates place the medieval infant mortality at around 25%. That means 1 out of every 4 babies born during that time period wouldn't make it past their first year of life. The odds went up a bit for children who made it to toddlerhood. Kids between the ages of 1 and 4 had a mortality rate of around 12.5%. If they made it to 5, then things looked better, as the mortality rate for kids between the ages of 5 and 9 was only about 6%. Still, that was far worse than even the highest mortality rate for infants in modern America. The sad truth is that being born in the Middle Ages didn't guarantee you a life, not by a long shot. Luckily for us, bubonic plague isn't such a problem nowadays. It does still exist. In fact, 20,000...
Did somebody in California get diagnosed with literally the plague? The plague? So, yeah, I hope we don't get that shit back.
People came down with it between 2000 and 2009, including 56 in the United States, but it certainly doesn't exist on the scale that it did in the Middle Ages. In fact, were you to travel back in time to 1340s Europe, when the outbreak known as the Black Death was ongoing, your chances of survival would be somewhere between 7 in 10 and 2 in 5.
2 in 5? 2 and 5, bro. This would be like lockdowns. My views will go crazy. If you get an ultimate lockdown like this where people are scared to be outside, we would get the ultimate view count, bro. I'm gonna get view count of doom, bro. Just be so famous.
What? Nothing. Here's your number.
But then again, half of them will drop off by like the 3-month mark, because it would run through the whole town. Everybody be dead.
I'm not dead.
Yeah, he says he's not dead.
Yes, he is. I'm not.
He isn't?
Estimates suggest that the Black Death killed as much as 60% of the entire population of Europe.
Yo, 60% of the population? Imagine, bruh. Half your squad, you getting a squad wipe, bro. Imagine all your homies get wiped. You getting squad wiped in this hole, bruh. Squad
3
wipe.
out of every 5 people you met were going to be dead by the end of the pandemic, which peaked over the course of just 4 years. But the craziest part of all this is what happened after the outbreak died down. Since around half the known world had died off, the balance of power in Europe underwent a radical shift. Suddenly, peasants could ask for pay raises and demand improvements in working conditions, and in many ways,
Bro, if you're a peasant, but why not just go up the hierarchy and just steal all the gold that like a lot of the rich people probably died from? Like, couldn't you just steal the gold and not be a peasant anymore?
actually got
They don't have that higher level thinking, bro.
better for them, and all it took was the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Everyone in medieval Europe was a good Catholic, except for those who weren't, and they either had to make pretend or die for their beliefs. And that's because the religious freedoms enjoyed today were most definitely not a thing. During the 11th and 12th centuries, for example, people started thinking critically about the Catholic Church, and one of the things that some of those people disliked most about the Church was its vast wealth and power. Unfortunately, these were dangerous times, and the Church was so wealthy and powerful that it could snuff out pretty much anyone who criticized it. In the name of God, obviously. No one is really sure how many people were burned during that time period, but what is known is that it was sometimes done in groups of 200 or more, and this didn't end for a long time either. Queen Mary of England burned 300 Protestants over the course of the 1550s. Women had it.
I mean, 300. the 1550s, so are we talking about like the whole 50s, so like 10 years till the 60s, or are we talking like 1 year? 300 in 1 year is a crazy number, but 300 over 10 years, I mean, that's like, you know, cost of doing business, low key.
Especially hard during the Middle Ages, they were generally regarded as morally weak and weren't allowed to do things that modern women take for granted, such as getting a job, deciding who to marry, or generally having opinions about things. There were some powerful women,
and they say the patriarchy is still alive. Wrong.
But they were pretty uncommon. The worst part about being a woman, though, was that you were expected to procreate or else become a nun. And you wouldn't have been too mad to have taken that second option, considering the intense dangers of childbirth, which would kill like 1 out of every 3 women. In comparison, today's
I'm not gonna lie, bro. I'm not gonna lie. Everybody died in childbirth back in the day, bro. The way motherfuckers make it seem like if you survived, like, that's crazy. Like, everybody used to die in childbirth back in the day.
Mortality rate is 1 out of every 5,814. In fact,
Damn.
Childbirth in the Middle Ages and the Tudor period was so dangerous that women were encouraged to write out a last will and testament well in advance of giving birth, which kind of puts a damper on the whole thing. Popular culture based around the medieval period tends to focus around the higher echelons of society, kings, queens, nobles, and other aristocrats, for example. But those people only made up a small fraction of society. Peasants, on the other hand, comprised around 90% of the population, meaning the chances were good you'd be slinging mud with the rest of them.
Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh? That's what
The problem was
yeah, bro, back in the day, there was no such thing as the middle class, if we're being real.
A peasant, unfortunately, is that the life of a peasant pretty much sucked. Peasants wore the same rough, itchy wool outfit every day, ate bread, porridge, and vegetables, and if they were lucky, got a little bit of meat every now and again. On top of that, whenever the weather sucked, they died. Peasants would starve when the weather was too wet, and they would starve when the weather was too dry, because when the crops failed, so did they. The average life expectancy for a peasant in medieval Europe was between 25 and 30 years old. If you wanted
bro, if you die before your 20s and your 30s, bro, you basically a medieval peasant. That's crazy.
Travel in the Middle Ages, the local monastery usually offered a clean, safe place to sleep. But what if there was no local monastery? Well, in that case, you might be able to stop at an inn. Conditions in most inns weren't exactly perfect, but they were usually a safe enough place to spend the night.
I'm not gonna lie, bro. I like going to like a local hotel or motel, like in that city. Like Hilton's, you know, too bougie for me. Sometimes you gotta go to like the Red Roof, you know. Sometimes you gotta go to the Motel 6 to really get to enjoy the city, you know.
Going, however, you weren't always going to have the option of staying in an inn, and that might mean sleeping out in the open, which was a really, really terrible idea. There were always unsavory characters lurking on the roads after dark, and wild animals were a serious problem too. People embarking on pilgrimages during the Middle Ages.
Yeah, bro, imagine you with your homies. Damn, bro. Yeah, Jimmy got ate up by a wolf yesterday, bro. He tried to go camping for real.
Often traveled in groups for safety, and wealthy people would sometimes just pay someone to go on pilgrimage for them. That may seem kinda like it defeats the point, sure, but it's gotta be better than risking it out on the road.
But that's the thing, that's where the lore is built. If you're, you know, on a pilgrimage, that's where the lore is built for real. You have to build your lore on a pilgrimage for real.
These wars have been fought for pretty silly reasons, and the Middle Ages were no different. Many of them, of course, were fought to decide which aristocrat or royal was going to end up sitting on the throne. But even though these were faraway disputes contested between people you'd probably never even seen before, you'd still be the one dying for them. It wasn't all bad, though. In many cases, if you weren't killed within the first 40 days, you could go back home to your family. That's because it was bad business to draft all the peasants into service at the same time. With no one around to take care of the farms, the kingdom would lose money, and then it wouldn't be able to afford the war in the first place. Noblemen died in war too, of course. Before 1550, roughly 30% of them could expect to perish in some battle or another. But as for the peasants, well, no one really knows, because peasant deaths were considered so inconsequential that no one ever actually counted them. It didn't help that defeat in battle often meant the systematic slaughter of the losing side, which would have been mostly made up of commoners. Not a good time to be a peasant or a soldier, that's for sure, and most of the time being one meant being the other. In the UK today, there are no capital crimes at all because they abolished the death penalty back in 1965. But long before that, medieval England was really big on executing people. During the Middle Ages, there were 50 capital crimes on the books, which included not just treason and various forms of murder, but lesser things like poaching, robbery, and forgery. Weirdly, however, this is one of those rare instances where you'd actually be better off in the Middle Ages than you would be a little later on in history. Sure, there are no capital crimes in the UK today, but by the 1600s, the number of crimes you could be officially executed for rose to around 200 and included things like petty theft, damaging Westminster Bridge, and cutting down a sapling. Although it's worth pointing out that the so-called
cutting down a sapling, bro. Imagine you trying to get that loud pack, and you just get fucking murked for a loud pack.
bloody code.
I mean, I guess that's what they got nowadays too. You know, you got the wrong person's loud pack, you might get murked.
Of that time
This is
period
ghetto
actually
language.
resulted in fewer executions, probably because juries were reluctant to sentence people to death for such minor offenses. Still, you wouldn't want to risk it, would you? Most medieval people may have been illiterate, but that doesn't mean they were stupid. Everything you've heard about how people in the Middle Ages covered the taste of rotten meat with heavy spices isn't actually true. Spices were expensive, and anyone who could afford them could also afford to throw out any meat that had gone bad. In fact, for the most part, people knew how to preserve food. They salted, smoked, dried, and pickled it, and there doesn't seem to have ever been a rash of people dying because they were eating bad meat. There were other dangers lurking in the food, though. If you were rich, you probably owned a nice set of fancy glazed dishes which were full of lead and other heavy metals like mercury. But when you filled your plates and bowls up with salty or acidic foods, the glaze would start to break down and those metals would leach into your food. So members of the upper class were slowly poisoning themselves as they dined on their luxury dishware. Getting sick during the Middle Ages was even more of a nightmare than it is today. There were no antibiotics, no chemotherapy, and physicians didn't wash their hands in between patients. The things doctors did know were mostly wrong and almost always totally useless from a medical perspective.
Yeah, he got a cough. Let's chop off his arms. He's got pneumonia. He doesn't need his feet.
A sick person could be diagnosed with the help of an astrological chart, for example, and treatment might include bloodletting, purging, or trepanning, which was the practice of drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure in the brain. Unsurprisingly, these treatments not only rarely worked, but sometimes even hastened a patient's death. Still, the practice of bloodletting persisted for a long time. In fact, there's still debate on whether George Washington was killed by strep throat or by the aggressive bloodletting doctors used to treat the condition. If you somehow managed to escape all those other dangers, you'd still be left with one very harsh truth. The medieval period was very, very violent. In fact, according to History Extra, murder in medieval England was around 10 times more common than it is today. And there's a reason the men had it.
Motherfuckers was just murking each other left and right for no reason. They just straight murking each other, bruh. They were like, nah, we do not want no peace over here. It's straight beef, bruh. They wanted straight beef, bro.
Much worse than the women. Life expectancy for women in the Middle Ages was actually considerably better than it was for men, despite the fact that they frequently ran the risk of dying in childbirth. On average, a woman could expect to live about 9.4 years longer than her male counterparts, and that was mostly because of the constant violence that existed between men. Roughly 46% of all deaths in men ages 15 and above were caused by violence, so a man living in medieval England had a roughly 1 in 2 chance of meeting a bloody end. All in all, those really aren't great odds.
1 in 2? Are you serious? Bro, 1 in 2 chance?
Crusades were a pretty violent time for Europe and the Middle East.
Tragically, though, the violence isn't the only thing that would kill you if you lived during that era.
Let's say you embark on the First Crusade in 1096. The Pope has promised that if you die in combat, all your sins will be forgiven and you'll go to heaven. If you're a knight, that's very convenient because you also fight in non-holy wars, which are considered sinful. Plus, if you don't fight, you'll be branded a coward.
If you're a peasant, you're worried about going to hell not for who you
Damn, bro. People were clout chasing even back in the day, bro. Everybody just be clout chasing at all times.
fight, but for what you eat.
According to National Geographic, famine ravaged France before the Crusades, killing thousands of peasants. Many of those peasants resorted to cannibalism as they embarked on an unorganized crusade that was easily defeated by Turkish.
I'm not gonna lie, bro. You might die on a crusade, but it seems like the adventure of a lifetime, though, bro. Going on a crusade adventure just seems so much fun. Are you gonna die? More than likely. Will you come back? Never. But it just seems like an adventure of a lifetime. It's like Skyrim in real life, bro. You going on full-on Skyrim adventure.
Forces. A second, more successful group of crusaders also struggled with hunger. As the Telegraph explained, 4,500 knights were joined by 35,000 people fleeing famine and poverty without weapons or even shoes. It would take 3 years to reach Jerusalem, and if you didn't die on the way...
You ain't got no shoes, bruh. That's the worst type of fucking pilgrimage or going to war. Bro, if you don't got no shoes and you gotta fight, bruh. No wonder people just were angry all the time, bruh.
You still had to scrounge for food. According to eyewitness accounts, Crusader cannibalism was so rampant that they were seen placing body parts on spits out in the open. Summer in the Holy Land was hell during the Crusades. According to the World of the Crusades, a daily life encyclopedia, the normal heat of the season was made worse by the medieval warm period that scorched the area from about 950 to 1250. That time span covers the 1st through 6th Crusades and part of the 7th. Along with the heat wave came lethal thirst that killed many crusaders along the way. And even if you could manage to find water, your enemies might take it before you could. Perhaps the best example of weaponized dehydration occurred in 1187, when the Sultan Saladin defeated King Guy in the Battle of Hattin. Saladin lured Guy's army away from a water source that gave the king a distinct advantage. The Crusaders withered in the sun, and Saladin's troops cranked up the heat. Guy's incredibly thirsty men couldn't fight back effectively. Saladin went on to retake Jerusalem from Christian control, setting the stage for the Third Crusade.
Back in the day, bro.
Stifling heat turned the Holy Land into a dry, blistering hellscape in the summer for much of the Crusades. However, winter was often just as bad.
Men and women alike died from exposure to snow, ice, days of heavy rain, vicious wind, and lethal hail.
Because of the mountainous terrain, torrents of water would wash away men and animals. When Richard the Lionheart...
It's like Earth is just like, I'm just gonna kill you any chance possible. Earth did not want these motherfuckers on Earth.
Army traveled to Ascalon during the Third Crusade. They braved downpours, hailstorms, and floods. All that water ruined food rations, and crusaders sank into soaked ground. If you traveled by sea, you might avoid the mud, but the Mediterranean Sea was just as dangerous. Crusaders traveling by boat risked sinking in a massive storm or having their ship smashed against rocks. If you managed to get to the Crusades without dying along the way, and you didn't die in battle, then the doctor tending to your wounds might kill you. After all, the Crusades took place during the Middle Ages, when medicine was still very crude. This was a time when infant mortality was sky.
Ain't nobody trying to let you live, bro. They all want you dead. Your doctor gonna kill you. The fucking environment is gonna kill you. Everybody's trying to murk you. It's getting real oppy outside, bro. It's getting real oppy outside.
High. Mothers consistently died during childbirth, and doctors treated mental illness through barbaric methods. Battlefield medicine was especially rough. According to NBC News, a doctor at a Crusader hospital once amputated a fighter's leg because of a small infected wound. That patient died. Doctors had it rough too. A paper published by the National Center for Biotechnology Information recounted how one crusading nobleman wouldn't let doctors make potions for fear that he'd be poisoned. This kind of fear led to doctors being executed for simply trying to practice medicine. The word scurvy often evokes images of seafaring pirates turning into scurvy knaves, but severe vitamin C deficiency could also affect crusaders. Vitamin C is easy to get for us, thanks to all the citrus we have in easy reach. Medieval people living through the Crusades didn't have that luxury. As author Andrew Holt explained, crusaders were largely meat eaters, in part because medieval knights thought of meat as something that made them strong. So how bad did scurvy get? It killed 1/6 of the French army during the Fifth Crusade. According to the book Plagues and Boxes, Crusaders laying siege to the Egyptian port of Damietta in 1218 suffered everything from severe pain in their feet to swollen gums to loose teeth and blackened shins. One of the defining diseases of the Crusades was dysentery.
A lot of people just killed the chef being like, he's poisoning us. They don't know what disease is. He's poisoning us. Mark him. They fucking killed like 30 fucking chefs being like, it's him, but it's the meat. Pause.
Is basically parasite-induced super diarrhea. That illness killed King John and countless soldiers across history's wars. Crusaders may have contracted dysentery by drinking water tainted with human waste. Perhaps the most famous case of the disease happened in the 7th Crusade, when dysentery devastated much of Louis IX's army and afflicted Louis himself. In the spring of 1138, the Syrian city of Aleppo faced a siege. In the fall, after that siege was abandoned, it faced something far worse. In October of that year, a massive earthquake reduced parts of the city to rubble. According to Britannica.com, the quake leveled the citadel, killing hundreds. It also wrecked surrounding towns, destroying a Crusader fortress and a Muslim fort. An estimated 230,000 people died in the disaster. Earthquakes were a bigger problem during the time of the Crusades than you might think. In addition to dealing with dehydration, starvation, sickness, or arrows to the spleen, you also had to worry about the ground shaking beneath your feet. According to the book Medicine in the Crusades, more than a dozen earthquakes may have occurred in the era of the Frankish Crusader states, which were situated along the Dead Sea Fault system. Another powerful quake rocked Antioch in 1115, collapsing walls and scaring people so much that some of them jumped off buildings. During medieval times, crimes usually had cruel punishments. Depending on what crimes you committed, you could be boiled, stoned, impaled, beheaded, roasted, or killed in some other awful way.
A Gizmodo
Boiled? What type of freak shit is this? Boiled is crazy work.
article pointed out that protections for accused criminals basically didn't exist, and using brutal torture to force confessions was encouraged.
Unfortunately for everyone living back then, the Crusades made all of this worse. According to the Encyclopedia of Violence, Peace, and Conflict, Christians associated homosexuality with Islam, and homosexuals could be burned at the stake in the time of the Crusades. The Crusades also fostered animosity toward Jews, heretics, lepers, the poor, and moneylenders. In 1275, King Edward I of England established the Statute of Jewry, which plunged Jews into poverty. In 1290, Edward exiled 3,000 Jews, some of which died after a ship's captain left them to drown on a sandbank. Even if you're not a Christian,
he was an OG Nazi. It's crazy. OG Nazi.
You might assume that being one would generally align you with the Crusaders. The truth is that all depends on what brand of Christianity you believe. After all, the Crusades took place before the Protestant Reformation paved the way for non-Catholic Christians to thrive. Depending on what stage of the Crusades you lived in, deviating from the Catholic Church's teachings might have gotten you killed. According to Britannica.com, the 12th century saw a large expansion in what Crusaders aimed to achieve.
Instead of focusing only on the Holy Land, they also set their sights on souls in Europe.
Christians who didn't strictly adhere to Roman Catholicism were considered a threat that was possibly more dangerous than Muslims, because they represented a threat from within.
In France, tensions over religion culminated in the Albigensian Crusade, which saw the Catholic faction of the north declare war on the Cathari in the south.
But that should be so scary, bro. Fighting in a sword fight is so scary, bro. Getting in a gunfight is crazy enough, but sword fight, oh my god.
Cathari had unorthodox beliefs, so Crusaders slaughtered them by the thousands and burned them on giant pyres.
Catholics living in southern France became collateral damage in this slaughter.
The Albigensian Crusade also laid the groundwork for the Spanish Inquisition that would come later.
Expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition? Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
If you were Jewish during the Crusades, many Christian warriors considered you just as much an enemy as the Muslims they planned to fight. The Jewish
did Muslims and Jews always get lit up, bro?
Christians viewed Jews as murderers of Christ, and some used the Crusades as an opportunity to get revenge. This was especially true of the First and Third Crusades. And during the People's Crusade of 1096, a band of peasants led by a monk named Peter the Hermit murdered hundreds of Jews. Meanwhile, Muslims clashed with both Christians and other Muslims. If you happened to be a member of the Ismaili Muslim minority, you were liable to get massacred by the ruling Sunni establishment. The strife between factions also bled into the Crusades. After the Muslim ruler of Damascus massacred 6,000 Ismailis, the Ismaili leader in Syria surrendered a city to Crusader King Baldwin II in return for protection. If you're going to live during the Crusades, it's probably best to be an iconic king or a legendary warrior.
This was the era of King Richard I, Saladin, the Knights Templar, and the Ismaili assassins who inspired the Assassin's Creed games, after all.
Perhaps being legendary would even help you survive, sort of like the main character in a movie. Well, King Baldwin IV was also legendary, but he had leprosy and died before the age of 25. Many of the other legends didn't do so well either. Richard the Lionheart of the Third Crusade faced deadly storms and the even deadlier Saladin.
I am not those men. I am Salahuddin.
King Richard died warring with his former co-crusader, King Philip II. While overseeing a siege, Richard caught a crossbow bolt to the arm and died from a wound infection. Meanwhile, Saladin, the great sultan, brilliant architect of the Battle of Hattin and conqueror of Jerusalem, likely died of typhoid fever. The stealthy Nizari Ismailis changed history by assassinating Conrad of Montferrat before he could be crowned king of Jerusalem. But they were destroyed by the Mongols in the 1250s. And the Knights Templar? They were skilled bankers and ferocious fighters, but after losing the last Crusader stronghold in 1291, they also lost favor with King Philip IV, who owed them money. Philip tortured Templars and burned dozens of them at the stake for made-up crimes. War is always hell, even when a pope proposes it. It is also the most obvious thing that could kill you during the Crusades. What might not be obvious is just how violent warfare could be. When Crusader forces...
Y'all couldn't tell? It's violent? What? War is the most violent. What?
Finally captured Jerusalem in 1099, they massacred just about everyone inside. According to the New York Times, men, women, and children were killed. There was apparently so much blood flowing in the streets that it was ankle deep. Jews who defended the city...
Blood that is ankle deep? Why are these motherfuckers beefing so much? Why are they so angry?
Alongside their Muslim neighbors, were locked in their synagogue, which was set on fire. And if you happen to live in the Byzantine capital of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, there's a good chance you'd be slaughtered, not by Muslims, but by the Crusaders who were supposed to be your allies. According to the Ancient History Encyclopedia, deep distrust and religious tensions between Holy Roman and Byzantine empires led Crusaders to sack Constantinople, looting and murdering as they went. The bloodshed was so intense that it was said the blood flowed through the streets of the city like a river for days.
With holy wars like that, you wouldn't need an...
For days? Days, not hours, not weeks, like days?
Actual hell to punish you for your sins.
You'd already be living in hell, and probably dying in it. Compared to other ancient civilizations, life was simpler back in Greece, right? Wrong. While we'd like to imagine it as a cultured and sophisticated society, there's absolutely no way you'd survive life in ancient Greece for long. Here's why. Feeling unwell? Prior to the 5th...
I'm barely surviving now. I'm not surviving in ancient Greece. The fuck?
Century BCE, the human body was basically left to the mercy of the gods.
I'm over here. If I can't have goldfish, I'm like, fuck.
Patients often participated in a healing ritual called temple sleep or incubation. It's exactly what it sounds like. Patients would literally just go to sleep in a temple, and then in the morning, they'd tell a priest about their dreams from the night before. Based on that dream, the priest would then prescribe a remedy, usually in the form of an incantation or a charm of some sort, or they'd simply declare the patient healed. There were technically doctors back then, but there weren't any specific
Chiropractors be like...
for people who advertised themselves as such. And as for surgery, these were the kinds of tools that were used, the stuff of nightmares.
This is going to be extremely extremely painful, Mr. Verrill.
What porno did they get that from? What the fuck?
Meanwhile, anyone who happened to live in Athens in 430 BC had a roughly 25% chance of dying in a horrible way. That's because a mysterious plague broke out that lasted for about 5 years, and the death toll was catastrophic. The plague ended up killing somewhere between 75,000 to 100,000 people.
What the fuck? Bro, everything's just trying to murk you all through the ancient history. What the fuck?
Aspects of the human body were a complete mystery in ancient Greece. People firmly believed that if a woman was ill, it was likely because she'd fallen victim to a wayward womb. You heard that right. This ancient piece of pseudoscience even had a name: the wandering womb. Some physicians believed the womb was an entirely separate entity that just so happened to live inside women. According to Wired, it was widely believed that these freewheeling wombs would be coaxed back into place by applying pleasant smells to a woman's you-know-what. Meanwhile, highly unpleasant smells were applied to whatever part of the body the womb had theoretically wandered off to. Oh, and there was another treatment prescribed for keeping a womb in place: pregnancy. And in the ancient world, pregnancy and delivery were exceptionally dangerous. According to women in antiquity, a pregnancy was prescribed for everything from fever and insomnia to chronic back pain. Jeez. Sparta is widely considered to be the most militaristic of the Greek city-states. At the height of its power, around 404 BC, the city of Sparta didn't even have walls. Inhabitants evidently felt that they didn't need them because they had Spartans. When it comes to Sparta, figuring out what's real and what's fiction can be tough. We know the land in Sparta was very fertile.
Now we got ice agents.
And not having to worry about food meant that people could focus on other hobbies, like poetry and bloody battle.
This is Sparta!
Sparta's militaristic bent began when it managed to conquer the neighboring land of Messenia, turning its inhabitants into slaves. Boys were trained from the age of 7 to 20, and they were basically expected to be resistant to hunger and cold, despite having given precious little in the way of food, clothing, or supplies. If they were suspected of having any kind of disability, the Spartans would kill them, usually when they were infants. According to National Geographic, the only time these slaves got a break from training was when they were actually at war. According to the BBC, the ancient Greeks took a minimalist approach to makeup. They didn't want the cosmetics to appear obvious. They just wanted their skin to look healthy. Unfortunately, these cosmetics were made from lead and mercury. In fact, such powders were used well into the 19th century. According to University College London, that's when women started using much more of the stuff and the damaging effects became quite apparent. Blackened skin.
Bro, look at her neck and look at her face. Oh my god. Bro, it's creepy. Bro, she fucking deep fried her skin, bro. She deep fried her skin.
Baldness, even damaged teeth. According to NBC News, both men
She's doing white face
and women in ancient Greece took to wearing lead face cream, which was believed to help keep their complexions clear and even improve the condition of their skin. It did neither, of course. Around 1177 BC, several civilizations fell, including the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the early Greek civilizations like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Cities were sacked and burned, trade routes abandoned. In a letter, Babylonian king Hammurabi described the scenario like this: "Behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." No one's really sure who these enemies were, but they do know a great many people met a grisly end at the hands of a group of raiders known only as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records tell tall tales.
Aliens? Aliens? The aliens were there back in the day. Wow.
Of a mysterious people who laid waste to the entire area. It seems as though they first showed up alongside the Hittites. Strangely, no one recorded who they were or exactly where they came from. They fought in Egypt and the Mediterranean for centuries, destroying entire cities and settlements and then moving on. And then these mysterious pirates fell out of Egyptian history in 1178 BC. Would you have survived their warships and ceaseless rampages? We're guessing the answer is no. According to punishment in ancient Athens, people were often punished by society out of sheer anger. anyone could bring charges against anyone else. About 96% of surviving court documents feature cases in which one person simply hated the other. By the time both parties were in court, it was the prosecutor's job to make the jury feel equally angry so that punishment could be handed out and supposed justice served. Suffice it to say, the laws of ancient Greece could be incredibly brutal. In the 7th century BC, Athens asked an aristocrat named Draco to draft a new set of laws. This
Draco
fellow is why we use the word draconian to describe particularly brutal laws. He was, in short, a complete and utter jerk. As Encyclopedia Britannica explains it, draconian laws were said to be written in blood rather than ink. Death was prescribed for almost all criminal offenses. Think you would have survived these harsh laws? You likely would have been sentenced to death for such arrogance.
A volcanic eruption that blocked out the sun, a rampage that wiped out half a kingdom, a plague that killed 50 million people. You think life today is tough? Think again.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
The term bubonic plague is likely to conjure up images of plague doctors wandering the streets of 17th century Europe, but those later outbreaks were
like fucking damn pigeons. What the hell?
Actually linked to the one that kicked off in the 6th century. It was known as the Plague of Justinian, after Justinian I, who was the Byzantine emperor when death and disease came to Constantinople in 542. Entire generations were born and died in a world tainted by this pandemic, which didn't end until almost 200 years later in 750 AD. The plague spread so quickly thanks to a perfect storm of conditions, including a cold spell that made food scarce and forced people to travel elsewhere for work. Trade boomed as a result.
Dying in the cold would be so painful. Dying in the cold would be so painful. You love 2025? Yeah, bro. It's a lot better than fucking living like this. Dying in the cold.
And plague-infested fleas hitched rides on rats that, in turn, hitched their rides on the boats and carts of trade caravans. By the time the plague had disappeared, it had devastated the population of the known world. The death toll is uncertain, but it's estimated that between 30 and 50 million people lost their lives. The symptoms of the plague of Justinian will be familiar to anyone who knows about the Black Death, and there's a good reason for that. In 2014, a team of researchers discovered that the strains of bacteria that caused these outbreaks weren't just equally deadly, but genetically related too.
What have the Romans ever done for us? Brought peace? Oh, peace! Shut up!
There's a saying that Rome wasn't built in a day, and it didn't fall in a day either. As the once mighty empire began to crumble, people who had lived under the protection of Rome for centuries were suddenly left to figure things out for themselves. By 410,
it's like the Soviet Union ending, bro. That's like people talking about the Soviet Union ending, bro.
Empire was in dire straits thanks to a combination of internal strife and attacks from outside forces, such as the Goths, Saxons, and Picts. Even when the empire's citizens were able to oust pretenders and would-be emperors, their appeals to Rome for help against these advancing tribes went unanswered. Take Britain, for example. The Romans initially hired a force of Saxon mercenaries from the European continent to defend the empire against the advancing Picts. For long, however, these same mercenaries had decided that they too liked the look of Britain.
Damn,
what happened
bro,
next
they
is a matter of some
on
contention
the
among historians.
That's the thing, bro. You can't be putting nobody on, bro. They flipped on the homie. Bro, I imagine you just hired your boy and he's like, nah, fuck you. Like, damn, bro.
While certain literary sources suggest that the Germanic tribes essentially wiped out the British natives, the archaeological record is less certain when it comes to the amount of bloodshed that took place. Still, while the destruction may not have been epic in scale, there was almost certainly some tension between the natives and the incoming Saxons. And of course, you still had to worry about those barbarian hordes knocking at the gates. William the Conqueror's invasion of Britain came at the very end of the Dark Ages, and it turned out to be a pretty terrible way to wrap up a terrible few centuries. At the time, William held the title of Duke of Normandy, and he believed that the Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor had promised to name him as heir to England. When Edward died in 1066, however, his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, took the throne instead. This sequence of events swiftly led to the Norman invasion of England, in which Harold was killed at the Battle of Hastings and William subsequently declared king. Unfortunately for England's population, William didn't seem too concerned with the lives of those he had conquered, especially when they put up resistance.
Bro, imagine fighting in a battle like this, bro. would have to lay dead. I would have to play dead, bro. Fighting like this, bro, you get, bro, the amount of PTSD you're gonna have. Bruh.
The northern regions of England continued to fight back against William's new regime, so William led a new campaign known to historians as the Harrying of the North. William decided to basically destroy the entirety of the north of England, and he did so with such efficiency that famine and cannibalism soon became commonplace. One historian, Simeon of Durham, wrote that before long there was simply no one left in most of the region's small villages. It would be 9 years before people started moving back, and the Doomsday Book of 1086 described about 1/3 of the north as an uninhabitable wasteland. During the Dark and Middle Ages, every bite of...
It will be kind of nice to live out in a remote area like that, but still have internet. I know I'm talking about a fictional world. Imagine you live in the middle of nowhere, but you have solid internet. That'll be a vibe. You don't have to worry about money. You can just live there remotely.
Bread could be deadly. For centuries, Europe had been the site of a
I feel like you
devastating
go
plague
crazy after like 30 days, though. You go crazy after 30 days.
That became known as St. Anthony's Fire. It was named for the monks of St. Anthony of Egypt, an order that was founded in 1093 primarily
They
to
fucked
care
up
for the
his
afflicted.
fucking painting, though.
Reportedly, the
hell?
feeling of burning in the extremities would escalate into hallucinations and seizures, and the victim's limbs would soon turn necrotic and fall off at the joints. It wasn't until centuries later that
What the fuck are these diseases?
scientists figured out the cause of St. Anthony's Fire, the fungus known as ergot, which frequently infected rye bread. The fungus would produce a compound that interrupts the blood supply to the limbs, leading to the onset of the plague's symptoms.
These compounds are very dangerous. They can cause hallucinations, they can cause people to have dry gangrene, lose their fingers, lose their limbs.
The disease affected cows as well as humans, and
What
a small
the fuck?
handful of tainted grain was capable of destroying entire communities. In the grand scheme of things, the Catholic Church was still figuring out its whole deal in the Dark Ages. The 7th century, for example, saw the development of the Rule of St. Benedict, which were guidelines for those living in religious communities. And the Church was pretty hardcore right from the beginning when it came to people disagreeing on dogma. Any Christians who weren't on board with any elements of the Church's teachings were likely to find themselves on the receiving end of a good flogging, or even execution. Before the Dark Ages, there were a variety of different ways in which the Christian faith could be interpreted. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 was called to unify the Church, but that didn't stop people from believing what they believed. After the council determined what was right, however, the Catholic Church became relentless in its persecution of so-called heretics. Take the Paulicians, for example, a sect established by Constantine Solanus in the 7th century that believed no priest was needed to commune with God. He was stoned to death in 684 while his followers were burned at the stake.
Damn!
Those that survived founded the Bogomils, who later became the target of some of the bloodiest Christian crusades. In this era, the idea that you could decide the particulars of...
people just been beefing for like hundreds of years. This is nothing new to 2025, bro. Motherfuckers wanting to nuke people, that's been like part of human history, bro. That's what I'm getting out of this. Everybody just has to do war and then, we calm down.
Your faith could easily get you killed. It's difficult to know just how extensive anti-Semitism
Now they're gonna
was.
drop like 2-3 bombs. It's over. GG. Reborn Earth. 90% of the population gonna be wiped in the first few bombs, bro.
During the Dark and Middle Ages, but many records suggest it wasn't a great time to be Jewish, particularly after the papacy.
It really has been a problem for them, huh?
Gregory used economic policies to strong-arm Europe's Jewish population into converting to Christianity, and after his papacy ended in 604, events took a turn for the worse. That's when the church got together with Europe's monarchies to expel Jewish residents. Others were given the choice between converting to Christianity or becoming a slave, and anything that happened to those who chose slavery was seen as divine justice. Historians have even pinpointed groups of Jews who were specifically targeted by Europe's rulers. For example, beginning in 586, Sisebuto of Spain enacted severe laws against the Jews, and the punishment for breaking those laws was death by stoning or burning. By the time another king took over in 621, that doctrine had escalated. Any Jew found in the region would be punished with 100 blows, then exiled and stripped of their property. No discussion about the dangers of the Dark Ages would be complete without mentioning the Vikings. But here's the thing. There is a huge schism between schools of thought when it comes to figuring out just how bloodthirsty they really were. The Viking Age began with the sacking of the monastery at Lindisfarne on June 8, 793 AD. For the next 300 years, the Vikings would sail and pillage from Newfoundland to France to what's now Ukraine, apparently killing pretty much everyone who got in their way.
Because we are Vikings.
But could these be little more than stories? Well, maybe or maybe not. Independent journalist Patrick Cockburn has gone as far as suggesting that the Vikings committed atrocities on a scale not unlike those carried out by the SS in Poland during World War II. Others, however, have suggested that the viciousness of the Vikings has been hugely exaggerated.
Israel's a little
Either way,
touchy,
it's
yeah.
certainly true that the Vikings were violent to some degree, and surprisingly...
Israel is like that little kid at the playground that gets bullied by everybody, so when you try to be its friend, it'll just punch you in your throat to test your, test your might.
Enough that violence could sometimes go the other way. On November 13th, 1002, the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready ordered everyone in his kingdom to kill any Danish man they could find. By this point, Norse migration to England had been going on for generations, and the country had a significant Scandinavian population. It's uncertain just how many people were slaughtered during the St. Brice's Day massacre, but mass burial sites connected to Ethelred's orders have since been uncovered and excavated. The idea of a pilgrimage was to visit some sacred location in Christendom and ideally get a little closer to God in the process. The practice was widely popular as early as the 4th century, and throughout the Dark and Middle Ages, Europe's faithful were encouraged to undertake the journey to places as far away as Bethlehem and Jerusalem. It's also incredibly dangerous, however, and while the Knights Templar were formed in the 12th century to protect pilgrims on their journeys to the Holy Land, before that, everyone was on their own. Most pilgrimages would take a year or more, and on the way, pilgrims would face obstacles.
If you need to run away from your shawty, if you need a break from your relationship, baby, I'm going on a pilgrimage. I'm finding God, and you just disappear out of our life.
Obstacles such as bandits, shipwrecks, natural disasters, and disease. That last point is particularly significant, as for 2 whole centuries, pilgrims would have been journeying through plague-infested cities and villages. And getting there was just
imagine you run into the
return trip would be just as perilous. Bloodletting had been around for a long time by the time the Dark Ages rolled around. This practice began in ancient Egypt and spread to ancient Greece, so by the time physicians in the medieval era were doing it, it had a fairly respectable history in the field of medicine. In the Dark Ages, though, people got a little carried away. Bloodletting was used in the treatment of a shockingly wide array of illnesses, from epilepsy and gout to the plague. Special tools were used to puncture arteries.
Bruh. Why? Little Jimmy, you got a sore throat? Oh, you a little sick? Let me do some bloodletting. Crazy work.
And if that sounds incredibly dangerous, it's because it is.
No way.
Many historians now believe that the practice killed more people than it cured. Most of the time, the amount of blood
that's crazy
was measured by how long it took for a patient to pass out, and that's when they generally stopped. Death happened for a number of reasons, as not only was hemorrhagic shock and death from blood loss a very real possibility, but infections were common too. At a time before antibiotics, a wound becoming infected was more or less a death sentence. Much research has been done on the worst time in history for a European to have been alive, and the mid-6th century is a strong contender for the title. You've got the Justinian Plague, of course, which was really getting into the swing of things at this point in time. There were also a series of volcanic eruptions that began in 536. The first was so huge that it filled the Earth's atmosphere with dust, sulfur, and ash. So much debris that it blacked out the sun for an incredible 18 months. The result was a global drop in temperatures, leading to widespread crop failure and famine. Layer the plague on top of that.
Why is there like one global warming event and all of a sudden it's famine on the fucking scoreboard? Like, what the fuck?
That, and you've got a scenario best described by the Byzantine historian Procopius, who wrote, "Men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death." Strangely enough, it was believed for a long time that the environmental effects of those eruptions had been exaggerated by contemporaries. It wasn't until the 1990s that data from tree rings confirmed that the stories were absolutely true and that the world had been plunged into what's now known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. As Harvard professor Michael McCormick,
dying in an ice age would be terrible, bro. I would rather just kill myself. Dying in an ice age is so horrifically bad because you're not going to be comfortable anytime. God damn it.
Sums it up. It was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive. Bullets, disease, mining accidents, and tarantula juice? Statistically, you wouldn't have lasted a single day in the Wild West.
Why?
Before anyone could survive in the American West, they had to get there first, and there was a pretty good chance of dying along the way. Britannica estimates that between the 1840s and 1860s, there were between 300,000 and 400,000 people who headed west on the Oregon Trail alone. Of those, the National Park Service says that 1 in 10 died before they reached the Promised Land. There are almost a shocking number of ways people died, with some of the most common causes being gunshot wounds, accidents, weather-related tragedies, drowning.
Hey, chat, let me know. Would y'all go on the Oregon Trail? Would you take that journey across the Americas, bro?
Crossing the trail's multiple rivers and, of course, dysentery.
What's that?
That's where you poop to, Krog.
And those are just the big ones. There were plenty of other risks, too. Rattlesnake bites could turn deadly, and at the time, bison were still all over the place. A stampeding herd could quickly and easily overrun a wagon train, and they did. The animals traveling with the convoy were also a major danger. Most traveled with their own herds, which included oxen, horses, and mules. Beyond riding accidents, people were often kicked or killed in stampedes. And perhaps the most tragic of these deaths are those who fell off wagons and were either crushed by the wheels of their own or other settlers' wagons, or were dragged along behind them. When Dr. Jim Kornberg
bro, they hitting that fucking team damage, bro. They hitting that team damage. You
spotlight on the fastest killer in the Old West for True West magazine, it wasn't an infamous gunman as you might expect. Rather, it was cholera. A bullet, after all, can only kill a very limited number of people, but cholera is a gift that keeps on giving. In 1873 alone, a major cholera epidemic swept through the West, and at this point in history, the medical community understood exactly how it was spread. The bodily fluids expelled were called cholera poison, and in Dr. John M. Woodward's 1,144-page report to Congress, he concluded that disinfecting everything that could be disinfected was the way to go. Unfortunately, disinfectant was hard to come by in the West, and people kept on dying. And that's just one disease. The National Park Service says that measles, scurvy, dysentery, pneumonia, and smallpox were also common. Smallpox came to the Americas with the Spanish, and once it was there, it and other European diseases killed around 90% of native peoples in North and South America. The disease drove the native populations to horrifying extremes. One incident was recounted by historian David Dari, who found a newspaper account from 1878 of an Apache medicine man who, after diagnosing 2 babies with smallpox, shot and killed them both with a single bullet.
Damn.
Historian David Dari wrote Frontier Medicine, a book that gave a disturbing look
into about having a bad day. Damn.
What being a doctor in the Old West meant, both for the doctors and their patients. It's truly grim stuff, and he found that doctors were largely making things up as they went, frequently prescribing cures that did more damage than the illness or injury.
I had a cold a couple years ago. I went in there. You know what he said to me? He goes, "Oh, you need an ear nail." A nail in my ear.
And tragically, due to cultural bias, white doctors often scoffed at the medicinal knowledge of Native American tribes, a treasure trove of information that could have done some real good. There were essentially 3 options for anyone who was sick or injured: waiting for a doctor, treating their own problems, or just giving up the ghost. If the doctor showed up, he might perform a bloodletting or administer a weird medicine like the 1815 cure for arthritis and gout. That involved killing a dog, filling the body with things like turpentine, brimstone, and nettles, then roasting it over an open fire. And just breathe.
At least I know my boy's trying, you know? At least he's trying. I don't know if that's gonna do shit for me, but at least I know the boy's trying.
Then the fumes, and you're cured, or not. It's no wonder that many turn to self-medicating for chronic conditions.
Fuck if that
One of these people was the famous gambler Don Holloway. Forrest Tennant, MD, says that he self-medicated with opium and alcohol when he developed tuberculosis. And while he lived longer than expected, he was also regularly coughing up chunks of his lungs.
Damn.
Watch literally any Hollywood Western, and it'll quickly become clear that bodies were dropping left and right. Nothing was sacred, and no one was safe. But is that accurate? Not really, says Montana State University professor Terry.
I don't think they'll be fucking it's on sight. Bro, that's probably where it's on sight comes from, bro. Old Western, pop, pop. Like, it's on sight. If I see Jimmy tomorrow, it's on sight. Fuck throwing hands. Pop, 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 bro. They were the good old Chirac back in the day, bro. It's an old Western, bro. That's good Chirac.
Anderson. He told Live Science that despite the popular depiction of the West as a place where everyone settled disputes with bullets, oftentimes things were much more civil, but they weren't exactly peaceful either. The Ohio State University's Criminal Justice Research Center did a deep dive into homicide rates in the Old West and found some surprising stuff. Let's take Dodge City during the boom years. Between 1876 and 1885, residents had a 1 in 61 chance of dying a violent death. Their homicide rate was around 165 per 100,000, and while that doesn't sound like much at all, let's put that into perspective. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say that in 2020, the homicide rate was about 7.8 per 100,000, and even that was a huge jump from previous years. Ohio State puts the chances of being murdered in Dodge City on the higher end, but even the low end of the scale is comparatively high compared to today's numbers. It was reported that Oregon had the lowest homicide rate at about 30 per 100,000.
Imagine, bro, they just go in a gunfight, you're like, oh shit, what the fuck? I just came out for some milk. Oh shit. Pop, pop, pop. Everybody just shooting each other, bro. Crazy. It's a movie. Back in the day, they'd be like, yeah, bro. My life's a movie. Yeah, I went through fucking 4 shootouts this afternoon getting goddamn cheese and a sandwich.
Being murdered was a very real and constant threat. To talk about the likelihood of dying in the Old West, it's absolutely necessary to talk about the people who perished the most. Those were, of course, the Native Americans who had been living on the land for generations. Numbers are hard to come by, but it's estimated North America was home to somewhere between 5 and 15 million people at the end of the 15th century. But by the end of the 19th century, there were less than 238,000 remaining. Just what happened is complicated to sum up, but here are a few of the major reasons so many Native American lives were lost. As mentioned, smallpox was particularly devastating and was responsible for a massive death toll. In addition to rampant diseases, a series of wars, including the Battle of Tippecanoe, the War of 1812, and the Seminole Wars, further decreased numbers, along with outright massacres like the Sand Creek Massacre. Then there were forced relocations like the Trail of Tears, which killed thousands of Native Americans in the 1830s, where natives were forced to leave their ancestral homelands and walk more than 1,000 miles to land that the US government decided they could live on, meaning that tragically, the Native Americans who survived the Old West were the exception and not the norm. It's no secret that some days are only survived by being able to kick back with a good cocktail. But in the Old West, that cocktail at the end of a hard day could mean the end of your life. Most Westerns might choke.
Fuck, bro, you can't even drink your problems away, bro. What the fuck, bro? You can like just enjoying a drink. Bro, it's the last drink you ever had. You just had a shit of a day. You just went through 75 blocks of shootouts. You get to the nearest bar to get a drink, and then the drink is so poisonous, it kills you. Bro, I'll be so mad, bro. Holy fuck.
Cowboys and outlaws alike sidling up to the bar and ordering a whiskey from the town saloon. But according to the Tahoe Daily Tribune, in addition to locally brewed beers and plain old whiskey, saloons were much more likely to be serving up drinks like the potentially deadly tarantula juice.
Hey, Marshall, here's...
Drinking it allegedly caused those who consumed it to lash out violently because it contained the deadly and hallucinogenic
If I get that tarantula juice, bruh, yo, I'm shooting up the bar. Before I die, I'm hitting everybody. Bro, somebody gave me tarantula juice, bruh. You gotta let that shit loose. You gotta turn that shit into Swiss cheese. Everybody going down. What the fuck?
A chill-inducing name because those who frequently partook of it often complained of feeling like they were covered in crawling spiders. The CDC says that only small amounts of strychnine are needed to cause strychnine poisoning and death. However, strychnine wasn't the only questionable substance in alcohol in those days. In many saloons, it was all about stretching liquor as far as they could and raising profits, which meant many saloons were cutting their liquor.
Each drink is probably frying your brain, bruh.
And serving customers a potentially deadly mix of booze, gunpowder, turpentine, and even ammonia. So with that said, down the hatch.
Damn it, no!
The dangers of drinking too much are well documented, and in the Old West, it wasn't.
like drinking gasoline, bro. You just take one shot of it, it's over.
Just what they were drinking, but how much as well. Starting with the fact that, according to True West magazine, it wasn't an uncommon sight to see a teenager in a saloon drinking with adults. Arizona's official historian Marshall Trimble says that before many hit 16 years of age, they would be classified as severe alcoholic.
What the fuck?
By today's standards. According to historian W.J. Raribaugh, peoples of all ages, including toddlers, were starting the day with a stiff drink and ending with a nightcap, beginning as far back as the 1700s. Alcohol use reached a peak in the 1800s, thanks in large part to massive corn crops and the profitability of turning that into whiskey. Basically, everyone was drinking all the time, and by 1830, intake was astronomical.
Yeah,
let's put it this
fucking
way.
life
If someone
was
today
shit.
were
If
to
you're
start
going through
drinking
that
like
many shootouts to get home, bro, you're stressed out. You're fucking stressed out.
Someone in the 1830s, and we're certainly not recommending that you do, they'd be drinking 3.5 bottles of whiskey every week. Research from the book Alcohol and Opium in the Old West says that drinking was seen as a perfectly acceptable pastime, so much so
bro,
that
they
abuse and
drinking
addiction
whiskey like motherfuckers drink water. 3 bottles?
would ultimately lead to the temperance movement and prohibition. Starting with the California gold rush of 1849, mining operations started popping up all across the West. As they did, the Independence Hall Association in Philadelphia says that more and more precious metals were found. Eventually, miners weren't just looking for gold, they were also looking for fortunes in silver, copper, lead, and zinc, all of which were key components to the nation's rapidly advancing industries. Montana State University Professor Emeritus of History Pierce Mullen says it quickly became clear just how many ways there were to die in mining, from mine collapses and explosions to falling down ladders that stretched for hundreds of feet. Exhaustion played a huge part in the danger, and so did sanitation. Miners typically lived in closely packed communities that were breeding grounds for disease.
Damn, bro, that motherfucker's gotta be like 5 fucking mining, bruh. Your life is over, dude. You're done with. You got fucking lung cancer to the 11th fucking degree, bruh. You're gonna die by about 17 and 2 months, bro. Fuck, dude. Y'all are miners fucking just inhaling straight smoke and tar.
And they were drinking water contaminated by their not-so-sanitary living conditions, as well as the runoff from the mines. True West magazine
Why
says
couldn't
that
motherfucker just build over and mine over? I don't know, bro. I guess all the good shit's on inside of the mine. But damn, bro, you like just getting murked. You dying like the longest death. You smoking cardboard 10 hours a day.
It was only at the beginning of the 20th century that the medical profession started to understand why so many miners were dying of lung-related disorders like tuberculosis. The start of the disease was in silicosis, which came from breathing silica-laden dust. That didn't result in sudden and premature death, and there was a good chance something else, like carbon monoxide poisoning, the loss of a few fingers or limbs, infection, or exposure to mercury and arsenic would. There were plenty of cold nights in the Old West, and countless men headed into the arms of these so-called painted ladies and soiled doves in search of companionship. Unfortunately, this whole industry was set up in such a way that it almost guaranteed a shortened life for both the women and their clients. Christopher Knowlton did a deep dive into the sex work industry on the frontier for his book Cattle Kingdom: The Hidden History of the Cowboy West, and he discovered that once women got into the industry, there was little to no chance of getting out. Most died young of conditions made worse by things like disease, addiction,
now it's
poverty.
real true gooners only, bro. You got OnlyFans. Every bitch got an OnlyFans, bro. They ain't gotta risk it like back in the day. The OGs laid the rule for them, you know?
According to Medicine in the Old West, some estimates suggest that about 50% of the West's sex workers had some sort of venereal disease, which was spread to the clients. They did take precautions, but it's easy to see how repeatedly using solutions containing chemicals like mercury, carbolic acid, mercuric cyanide, and boric acid might have been more than a little dangerous. It's unclear how many people died of venereal diseases from that time, because the cause of death was often listed on death certificates as something other than venereal disease.
I would have
often
to
it was
just
called
end it.
cancer
Oh
of the
my
brain,
God,
decay
dude.
that late-stage syphilis caused. All in all, it just wasn't a very fun time to be alive.
Damn, W video. I feel like, bro, we would die so quick. We would die so quick.